as it tells us. Well, thank you for being here. And again, I appreciate our series that we now call Inklings because no one knew what schematics was. So we decided to call it Inklings so no one would know what Inklings was either. But our mission has been to take important text. Some of them are small, some of them are more lengthy, some of them are ancient, and some are more current. But important text, and to look at them from a Christian point of view. And typically, we have included in our series one of Shakespeare's plays, because William Shakespeare is the most important English author. And in point of fact, most literary critics of all backgrounds, men like the German Goethe and others, view Shakespeare as the greatest author of all time, because when you begin looking at the entire scope of his work, not only his plays, which are extensive, but also his poetry. The man was a literary genius, and part of why his plays continue to resonate with us is he had such an insight into the human condition. Now, we have the barrier of his Elizabethan English, and we have to work through that. On the other hand, there's so much value in reading it, even in the original, rather than in an updated, simply because Shakespeare has fashioned our language. He is the greatest influence on modern English, only second to the King James Version of the Bible. There are many turns of phrase that we find that are commonplace, that were first coined by Shakespeare. And whenever we begin looking, we find that behind the language, there are insights that are truly monumental. So as we get into the play, let's first of all look at the major characters. We are considering, first of all, of course, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar is a Roman military and political leader. In the play, he has just returned to Rome in triumph after a victory in a civil war against Pompey. Now, in actual history, the time in between the assassination of Caesar and his return to Rome was a very short time, a few years, but not as compressed as we find here. What had happened is Rome had a history of being governed by kings, but the kings were overthrown and the Roman Republic was established. The Republic rests upon two different voting blocks. You had the plebeians, most people, and then you had the patricians who were represented in the Senate. Now, the Senate of Rome traditionally had 300 members, so it's much larger than our Senate, but still it was the upper house, and it was where a lot of the power resided. As Rome became more expansive, the military began to take more and more importance. And so we ended up with a situation where great generals were, they accomplished tremendous things. Caesar conquered Gaul, for example. And yet, having done this, the Senate of Rome feared him, and they put their support behind a rival general named Pompey. Caesar famously crossed the Rubicon with his legions, defeated Pompey, and entered into Rome victorious. He had the support of the people. The common people supported Caesar. And yet the Senate was always a little bit leery of him. However, because of his broad support, they made him not just consul, but consul for life. So essentially, a lifetime dictatorship. So that's just one step below being a king. So he enjoyed this power, and yet there was always a bit of unease. His ambition and potential for tyranny are pivotal in the plot, and his assassination sets off the main conflict in the play. Even though the play is called Julius Caesar, he's not around for much of the play. He is assassinated fairly early in it. The second major figure, and in fact, in many ways, the pivotal figure of the play, is Brutus. Marcus Junius Brutus is a senator, and he's a close friend of Caesar. He actually had been a supporter of Caesar early on, and he's known as a man of great integrity. He was a Stoic philosopher. He was an honest broker. His internal struggle between his loyalty to Caesar, which was personal and somewhat political as well, and his perception of what is best for Rome drives much of the plot. And in fact, we're going to go through, when we get to the end, at his death, Mark Antony, who had been the one who defeated him, referred to him as the noblest Roman of them all, because even though he took a side and it ended up being a side that lost, no one doubted his motives. Of all the conspirators against Julius Caesar, Brutus was never viewed as having any ulterior motive. Others were seeking to advance their own political ambitions. They were jealous of Caesar. This was not the case. Not so noble is Cassius. Gaius Cassius Longinus is depicted, and this is historically accurate, as a shrewd manipulator, as a senator. He is envious of Caesar's power, and he's very adept at persuasion. So his motivation in all of this is to advance himself. And the fact that Caesar is getting all these accolades and accumulating all this power, Cassius really would have liked to have had the power himself and to exercise it in his position as a senator. He is behind the conspiracy to assassinate Caesar. He plays a crucial role in persuading Brutus to join the conspiracy. His actions and manipulations significantly influence the course of events. And then we have the greatest supporter of Julius Caesar, Mark Antony. He's a loyal friend and supporter of Caesar. He is charismatic and very skilled in oratory. His funeral oration at Caesar's death, according to history, and Shakespeare amplifies this, is what turned the tide against the conspirators. In fact, that's how they began to be called conspirators. They initially were called liberators, but what's in a name? The rendition that Shakespeare gives, "Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears," one of the most famous orations in all of drama. And we find that he would bring about a new order with Octavius. Octavius, also known as Octavian, later he would take the name of Augustus, is Julius Caesar's adopted son and heir. He's young but shows promise as a leader. He's a symbol of the future of Rome. His character in the play foreshadows the rise of the Roman Empire, as indeed he would become the first emperor of Rome. He forms a triumvirate, that's a ruling party of three, with Antony and Lepidus to avenge Caesar's death and to stabilize Rome. We have a couple of very prominent women in the drama, and this is something that is very different and very modern with Shakespeare. In all of his plays, Shakespeare gives tremendous role and agency to women. He recognizes that women are crucial actors. Last year, for example, we looked at the play Macbeth, and Lady Macbeth was central to that entire drama. We find here that Portia is Brutus' wife. And this is historically true. She was known for her strength of character, intelligence, and loyalty. She's the daughter of Cato, a respected Roman statesman. Portia represents the personal domestic side of Brutus. In the play, her interactions show the insight and the sacrifices made by those close to the conspirators. You've got to remember that these are real people, and that the actions that they take have impact on their families. Now, in our country, when you lose an election, you go home, write a book, appear on Face the Nation, whatever, and get a job at Fox or CNN, depending on your political party, and everything's good. In the ancient world, and until relatively recent times, it wasn't quite the case. Whenever you were on the wrong side of a political conflict, very often the people on the wrong side ended up being put to death, and their families would be. Because, of course, the families represented a threat to the established order. So we see with Portia has great investment. She is an aristocrat. Her father was a famous senator. This is her world. And for her husband, Brutus, to be intricately involved in this assassination of Caesar is going to disrupt her world as well. We also find, and this is a case where Shakespeare elevates her beyond what we know in history, Calpurnia. Calpurnia is Caesar's wife, and she is portrayed as a loving spouse who is deeply concerned for her husband's safety. I mean, and this, no reason to believe that was not the case. But what we find is the role of premonition. Calpurnia was very attuned to the portents of the heavens, in particular that comets were flailing through the skies, and these did not portend for good things. We find that Caesar initially heeds, but then disregards her warnings. And we find in this one of the underlying themes, not only in this play, but throughout Shakespearean drama, of the role of fate as it plays out. We then have an important individual, but sort of a tertiary layer, is Cassius. He's a Roman senator depicted as cynical and somewhat sarcastic. He's one of the conspirators. He sets the tone of anxiety and foreboding, and this is actually the case. He was the first one to stab Caesar. So the plot summary. The play opens with Caesar's triumphant return to Rome after defeating Pompey. And remember, Shakespeare is compressing this a bit. This actually would have taken several months of action, of his return. And we find that Caesar was very, very popular. In particular, once he received the power of dictator for life, one of the first things he began to do is canceling debt. And you begin to look at, how popular a government canceling debt can be, especially in the masses. He also spent a great deal of money on entertainment. So the famous maxim, bread and circuses. And as a result, he was incredibly popular. He was gaining in his popularity, and it worried the senators in Rome. They were really concerned that Caesar would move from being simply the tyrant for life, the dictator for life, to becoming a king. Because dictator for life, at least you could say, well, the Senate's been around for hundreds of years. We can wait him out. He'll eventually die. We'll give him a state funeral and everything's back to normal. But not if he's a king. Furthermore, and it doesn't go into this in this play, but his dalliance with Cleopatra. Cleopatra famously went to Rome with her barges filled with riches from Egypt, and she and Caesar had an affair, and he fathered a son by Cleopatra. And so, the concern that Caesar was going to embroil Rome with intrigue from Egypt, and in particular, here we have this son who is an heir to the Ptolemy dynasty in the East. This is going to create the potential of Caesar setting up a Caesarian dynasty in Rome. So a lot of concern of what's going on. We then move in the play where Cassius begins to round up conspirators, most notably Brutus. Because basically, Brutus is the honest broker. The idea is, well, if you have Brutus on your side, then everybody else is going to fall in line, because they view him as a man of just sterling integrity. He's not someone who is a power broker for his own sake. And so Cassius, being very wily, being the mastermind, went and he finally persuaded Brutus that the assassination needed to occur. And it occurred on the Ides of March. Romans divided months into various segments, and the middle of the month was the Ides. In some of their months, it was on the 13th, others it was the 15th. The Ides of March are the 15th of March. And most notably, in the play, there's the warning given by a soothsayer to beware the Ides of March. But in spite of this, we have Caesar going into the Senate House, where he is assassinated by the conspirators, including his friend Brutus. Now, the number of conspirators was about 60. Now, remember, the Senate had about 300 or so members, so it was not most of the senators, but it was enough of them with blood on their hands that it was not a small thing. And purposefully, it was not a single person, but rather they agreed they each were going to have a part in it, so that there was a shared culpability. So it was not one person, it was a group that has done this. Now remember, Caesar had been given dictatorial powers. So as a result of his death, there's chaos. The government is in disarray. And then at the funeral, Um, there are two very notable speeches, one by Brutus, where Brutus explains himself to the Roman people, and he says famously, "It's not that I loved Caesar less, but I loved Rome more." And then Antony, who Shakespeare has him in a very wily way, beginning with saying, I'm here to bury Caesar, but then he ends up praising him. The actual history of it is fascinating because Antony in the funeral oration shows the populace Caesar's bloody toga. So you sometimes heard about waving the bloody shirt. Well, this is what he did. He showed the bloody toga, and he read from Caesar's will, because Caesar left most of his estate to the people of Rome. So he was buying favor even in death. The following this, the conspirators, I mean, they were senators, they were part of the government, but within a year, and again, you read the play and it's compressed in time, telescoped down, but it took about a year for a second triumvirate to be put together. Antony, Octavius, and Lepidus form a triumvirate. And they, first of all, they receive authority from the Roman government. And then they began issuing prescriptions. They began taking vengeance. And then they wage war. And we find that Brutus and Cassius retreat to the east. The play concludes after the Battle of Philippi. Cassius and Brutus each commit suicide. Historically, Cassius commits suicide first. And in point of fact, he misread what had happened. There were two flanks fighting this triumvirate that had come against them. And Cassius was leading one of these, and things did not go well for his group. The group that Brutus was leading, however, had been victorious, but the smoke signals they were using to communicate were not clear, and Cassius thought all was lost. And so he committed suicide, and that so demoralized the troops that then in the Battle of Philippi, they lost. And Brutus also followed suit. He committed suicide by having one of his trusted lieutenants hold his sword, and Brutus ran into it and took his own life. Romans, by the way, were prone to do this because it wasn't going to end well for them. They were going to be put to death, but they preferred to die on the battlefield rather than be hauled back to Rome, put on a parade, and then put to death. So this is the general plot summary. Some notable quotes. Probably the most famous quote in the entire play: "Beware the Ides of March." The soothsayer says this to Caesar as he is heading to the Senate House. And it has come to be a sort of a byline warning people against changes of fortune. Beware the Ides of March. Calpurnia says this, Caesar's wife, says, "When beggars die, there are no comets seen. The heavens themselves blaze forth the death of princes." In other words, she's saying, we've seen comets in the sky. This bespeaks the death of a leader of the nation. watch out, Julius. Don't take any chances. You better stay home. However, Caesar's famous retort to this: cowards die many times before their death. The valiant never taste of death but once. This, in various forms, has been repeated over and again. Basically, Caesar saying, you know what? I live a public life. I'm a soldier. I lead from the front, and he did, by the way. He was known for that on the battlefield. He was not an armchair general. He was a man who would fight. And his retort was essentially, I'm not going to cower. I'm going to embrace life, and when death comes, it comes. There is a comment that Caesar made about Cassius. Young Cassius has a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much. Such men are dangerous. And while this is a poetic statement, it's certainly not recorded in history. It certainly does reflect the character of Cassius. He was a manipulator, and he was ambitious, and his purpose in assassinating Caesar was indeed his own aggrandizement. He wanted to be the savior of the nation. And then, et tu, Brute, Latin incorporated into the play. Caesar says this to Brutus during his assassination, and seemingly the term may have even been used. This may be resting on history. Definitely, Caesar did not anticipate that Brutus would be among his assassins, and it's et tu, it's even you, and you, Brutus. After Caesar is assassinated, we find in the play Mark Antony coming in and viewing the dead body of Caesar, and he says, cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. Recognizing that the state was going into a time of civil unrest. At very least, there would not be a smooth transition back to senatorial rule, and there could be no pleasant end to this. And it was true. If the liberators had maintained their popular support, all those who were close to Caesar, like Mark Antony, would have found themselves on the short end of the stick, either going into exile or being executed. There was no peaceful resolution to this whole thing. And then, as I mentioned before, Brutus, in his speech to the Roman people, explaining himself, said, not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more. And this encapsulates both the struggle and the resolution. It explains why Brutus did what he did. He really believed it was in the best interest of the Roman state and traditions. And it was not out of any personal animosity towards Julius Caesar. And then Mark Antony's famous oration, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. And then Antony, once all was said and done, and he is viewing Brutus' dead body, made this comment: this was the noblest Roman of them all. So even Mark Antony viewed in Brutus, and this, by the way, was the assessment of both sides in the conflict. that Brutus was not a vile person. You know, because of his betrayal of friendship, we recoil at him. That was not the judgment of the ancient Romans. They viewed him as a noble person. Um, he hasn't fared so well historically. Dante put Judas and Brutus both in the hottest flames of hell because of their betrayal. Well, what are some important themes? First of all, the corrupting influence of power. Cassius says this of Caesar: and therefore think him as a serpent's egg, which hatched would, as its kind grows mischievous, and kill him in the shell. In other words, don't wait for Caesar to declare himself to be a king. Don't let it get any further than it's already gone. Take action. Take action now. Of course, we recognize James 3:16. For where jealousy and selfish ambition exist, there will be disorder and every vile practice. Lord Acton, in the end of the 1800s, famously said, power tends to corrupt. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's intriguing because he was saying that in reference to the elevated claims of the Roman pontiff when the Pope declared himself to be infallible in 1870. And I think we've seen quite a bit of corruption flow down from that. But the corrupting influence of power is certainly something that is seen here. And you've got to bear in mind, this was written at a time of a monarchy, and the monarchy in Great Britain was very delicately balanced with Parliament. And the idea that you're going to highlight the danger of a despotic leader was a very brave thing for Shakespeare to do. We find in this the conflict between fate and free will. And we look at this, Cassius is talking with Brutus and trying to persuade him that he needs to be a man of action, that he has agency. Cassius says, men at some times are masters of their fates. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves that we are underlings. This is something that comes through in many Shakespearean dramas. The idea of the struggle between fate and free will. And you begin to look at this, and even in Julius Caesar, you find a situation where Brutus is caught up in the wheels of events in a way that were beyond what he would have ever imagined. But the idea that the fault is not in the stars, but in ourselves. And then the question of the morality of assassination for the public good. And this is something that we have a very ambivalent history of. Technically, we do not order the assassination of the leaders of other states. However, it's a thing where in the Second World War, we were supportive of many of the attempts to assassinate Adolf Hitler. And if any of those had been successful, by the way, the war would have come to a very quick end, saving thousands, not only of Allied, but of German lives. So the question is, would you do it? Right now, the Israeli Defense Force is going into Hamas and they have stated every intention of killing the leaders of Hamas. Now, they may broker a deal where they're able to flee to Iran or some other place, but the question of setting out to kill an individual, not going into battle where you are arrayed against an army, but where you're saying, I want that person dead. We find Brutus tamping back the idea of violence. He said, let's kill him boldly, but not wrathfully. Let's carve him as a dish fit for the gods, not hew him as a carcass fit for the hounds. The idea being, okay, we're going to assassinate him. And because we have set ourselves to do this, we're going to do it boldly. You can't do half measures here. But it's not in wrath. It's going to be very measured. We find also the concept of manipulation and deception. And this is where we find Brutus struggling, because he was a man of integrity. He said, and therefore, since I cannot prove a lover, that is to say, Caesar's friend, to entertain these fair, well-spoken days, I am determined to prove a villain and hate the idle pleasures of these days. In other words, I'm not enjoying life. I'm not enjoying what I've made of myself. I've decided this is what I need to do, but it was easier when I was Caesar's friend. It was easier when everything was fine and I wasn't making these plots. But the deception had to be there. And then the unpredictability and mutability of public opinion. But yesterday the word of Caesar might have stood against the world. Now lies he there, and none so poor to do him reverence. The idea of Caesar literally 1 minute being on top of the world, being the dictator of Rome, and then being a lifeless corpse on the Senate floor. Things change, and of course, with the conspirators or liberators, however you want to depict them, the tide would turn against them as well. Well, this is what I have for Julius Caesar. Any comments or further elucidation, Jordan? Yeah. Looking over.
All of the Octavian who becomes Augustus back to their this initial descent from being adopted in the family.
Yes.
So reading history is very interesting. Doing the history, there are two people who say I am the Roman Empire.
And that the test of Roman citizenship, fealty to Rome, not citizenship, but fealty to Rome, was to take a pinch of incense and burn it on the altar and to say, Kyrios Caesar, Caesar is Lord. And of course, to Christians, no, Kyrios Christos, Christ is Lord. And that dividing point is what would cause Christians to be a proscribed religion for the first 300 years of their existence. Anything else? If not, thank you very much. Again, this is wrapping up our Inklings series for the season. We will be planning a new series this next year. And at that time, we will be releasing our list of topics and dates. As we're dismissed, Jordan, if you'll lead us in a word of prayer.
Father, thank you so much for the time